Rant. I am your host. Every time you turn around anymore, you see these companies laying off 4, 6, 10,000 people at a time. This used to rarely, if at all, ever happen unless companies were getting ready to go bankrupt and go out of business entirely. But anymore, it seems to be a commonplace practice, especially for large companies, to be able to make a quick buck, literally. Because every salary that's laid off becomes and shows as a profit on their balance sheet. And of course, that just acts like blood in the water to the investors. It used to be the companies valued those that they hired and wanted to invest in them just as much as the employees wanted to invest in the company, whether that be their time, their talent, and in some cases, their own money if that company was publicly traded. But now, that's kind of been slowly eroded over time. However, companies still require that same undying worshipful devotion like what many used to have when the original founder of the company was still around and in charge, not shoved off in some corner to be a consultant over their own company on some board who's only going to make decisions in their own interest. Anymore, you see a lot of these companies where the founder has either died or, more rarely, has actually sold their company, whether due to health reasons, scandal, they actually have it taken away from them by majority vote of the board, or they end up passing away, and the children who would normally inherit that family company don't want to have anything to do with it anymore. What I feel like we're seeing is a transitional period in the professional world and workplace where you have all of these original founders who started their companies 30 to 40 years ago, back when they themselves were in their 30s. And now all of those founders are either retiring, they're being bought out by a board, or selling out to the new, what it is, equity firms who are essentially nothing more than locusts. They swoop in, they buy up the company, they bleed it for all the wealth the C-level can accumulate, and then they kill it off, they sell it off, or just let it slowly die. In a previous role I was in, this was the very case. The company when I started was still being managed by the founder. Of course, they had bought companies, along the way, but a few years into it, and this is the ironies, but every position that I've had, it's usually been around that 5-year mark whenever they start talking about restructuring or making tough management decisions. And that's whenever everything about that company typically ends up slowly dying and no one recognizes it anymore. Even the people that have been there for, 20, 25 years, something like that. Usually this is in the form of the founder having, passed away, or in this particular case, an acquisition, but not just any. It was from an equity firm. And of course, this happened right before COVID, and everybody was already on edge about job loss because of the shutdowns. Thankfully, this company, against many manager wishes, still had everybody able to work from home full time. Because let's face it, if they didn't, their only other alternative, like so many other businesses, was to shut down. So they caved. Of course, after COVID, it was way more difficult for them to have people return because, like so many companies, they actually saw and promoted the revenue growth from that work from home status. So they essentially shot themselves in the foot when trying to argue that people were only productive in the office. I honestly feel at that point, though, the equity firm had already been laying people off, and so they felt this would just make it all that much easier to continue that practice as they began to completely transform this company and its workforce. Decades ago, the founders of companies actually hired people they believed in. Those people didn't have to fill 5 roles as a single person. They were compensated and they were rewarded. They were allowed opportunities to advance and grow in their career. You actually could consider your job as a career. Anymore, they're more or less, relegated to just coming in and, giving a little hi and a wave to new hires on their first day of employee orientation. The problem is that so many companies end up with leaders, typically the C-level, that view their role as nothing more than a stepping stone to their next company that they will ultimately destroy, just like they plan on doing with their current one. And naturally, whenever these companies grow to that size, the real relationships are just gone. And once companies see you as nothing more than a number on a balance sheet, they declare loyalty is no longer a concern of theirs. But still, at the same time, why is it still a concern of ours? That's why getting laid off for no reason, as it has become a current method of operation for many of these companies now, is so confusing and dehumanizing. At least whenever you get fired, you're given a reason as to why. You know why they're deciding to break up with you. You have something potentially to be able to work on toward bettering yourself for that next position that you have. though most times the reasons they find are typically very convenient and most times fabricated. But it's better than just agreeing to disagree and going separate ways. How did your role all of a sudden not correspond to the company's new direction if they never told you what that direction was in the first place? Growth in a company used to be a means of survival and sustainability. Whenever the demand was outpacing the supply, that was a reason to be able to hire more people, to be able to expand locations. And anymore, it's just become a means of very aggressive expansion to try to increase a company's size to the breaking point, whether it be financially, professionally, and the strain it puts on its employees to do more with less, and also to try to better its reputation. When profits are put ahead of people, it's a guarantee of certain failure. And the only question then is, to what extent will that failure damage that company? Will it be able to recover? And how long will that actually take? It almost reminds me of the story of Icarus, the Greek mythological character who flew too close to the sun with, his wings that were made of wax and feathers. He was very ambitious in his attempts, but his disregard for caution and concern over whether he should do that caused his wings to melt, and then, of course, he inevitably fell into the sea. These companies have become so emboldened when they take over an already successful company that they underestimate their allowances and end up making very stupid mistakes. And of course, they're not the ones who ultimately suffer that. It's the employees who were there before that buyer, that equity firm, ever even came along, before that firm ever threw a number out, before it ever even knew that company existed. Companies love to go on and on about their company culture, which wasn't really a big thing until about 15 years ago. Companies were not clubhouses. They were not sororities or fraternities. They were professional places of business, much like LinkedIn used to be. Companies weren't concerned so much about social media and their online reputation and presence as much as they are now. They're more concerned about what the online public and the bots in these social media platforms think about them than what their own workers do. We now see so many of these companies being transferred and refurbished from what the founders originally created. One example that is very obvious is Apple. Steve Jobs, for the horror stories you hear about how much of a slave driver he was, he at least cared about the design and aesthetic of a lot of the early public consumer laptop and computers and iPods that showed very thoughtful design and a care for the product and the company brand. But now with the current CEO, Tim Cook, have you seen the new design for the iPhone 17? It makes no sense. It's like when companies don't work on developing new ideas and improvements to their products, it's almost as though they're signaling that they really have reached the end of their creative rope, when all they do is add a backing plate and move the light and microphone from one side to the exact opposite of where the cameras are. However, the pattern now is for many equity firms and large corporations that are not usually mentioned publicly to step out into the light and buy these companies up. They want to make everyone feel as though they are there to keep everyone where they are, but then the next thing they do is send out that meeting invitation with your manager and an HR representative. Equity firms are never there to nurture. They're only there for profit, and most times your salary is also tied to their profit. Once they've profited as much as they can, they either sell, kill, or replace if something better comes along, and the cycle repeats. Most equity firms will not have two of the same type of service or company under their umbrella. One is all that's allowed. The others, they have to go. And usually it's the one that is most profitable or the longest lasting. And due to this, companies that were founded about 30 to 40 years ago with the cute little origin stories of being started in the garage or a small little plaza office or an apartment have come to be seen as commodities, now to be traded, sold, liquidated, and usually the employees are a part of that liquidation. The concept of community in modern day companies are not what they used to be. It's more of a fantasy that companies promote in order to mask or hide the true nature and reality of what it's like working in that environment, no matter whether they boast having free cereal bars, an arcade, all different types of coffee from around the world, an on-site cafeteria. It's all designed to make you work non-stop once you agree to the terms of service to them. Going along with this concept, it kind of reminds me of like a foster child, metaphor. One of the first things that they promote with a lot of new employees is this concept that we're family here. I would disagree, and I think that a lot of other people would as well, given the way the companies have changed that mentality over time. You're more like a foster child, given to the care and trust of a foster home, this corporation. You don't know how long you'll be staying there. If it's a nice foster home, you'd hope that it would be for a while, especially if you've just come from a really bad one. And of course, the founders were always fairly nice foster parents. They still cared about the company because it meant something personal to them. They cared about the employees because most times they thrived early on in the history of the company. But then one day it's announced the entire foster home is being sent to a new set of parents, a very nice couple called the equity firm. And the last thing they care about really is the well-being of any of the new livelihoods they've just taken over the responsibility of. They just care about the payout. They just care about how much each of them are worth, how they can be sold, traded, or just discarded. As I said in another rant, these companies never really look at anything through a lens of what long-term damage they can cause through their decisions. They only care about the short-term gains financially, all the while telling the employees that they're doing a wonderful job and no one else is getting fired. Laid off. But the credibility is shot, especially with younger generations now. These companies don't think about what the children are seeing being done to their parents, their friends of parents, their aunts, their uncles, brothers, sisters, and so on. That's something that will stick and will create a sense of avoidance. And we're seeing that even right now. All of these companies are hurting financially, though they're trying to put on a brave face because AI isn't panning out in some fields where they thought it would do the job of hundreds, if not thousands. When they come back looking for younger generations to work, they have already ruined their reputation with them. So now they have to make AI work. Of course, all of these equity firms have a playbook. They go through the same steps every single time they acquire a new company. The typical modus operandi of these firms is first privatize a company and buy back all of the stock to remove from the market and all of their employees. Then they begin to access the company's overall liquid assets, which usually leads directly to layoffs because people's salaries are the easiest to access. They're not going to sell off any kind of real estate holdings they may have or other office spaces that they are renting. They cut whatever fat they feel is necessary. Or, in the case of the last role that I had, they hired an outside firm who knew nothing about their business or their employees to tell them where best to cut costs. And when they themselves are oftentimes the fat, as they like to refer to it as, that needs to be cut, they are the ones who need to be cut most of all. They strip down everything that they don't understand and refuse to understand from the previous ownership, usually the founder as of late. And this is when the identity and the history and culture of the company gets completely demolished because, once again, profits over people, even though they wouldn't have the profits without these people. As they're laying people off, those people who are now gone, their salaries are represented as revenue on the balance sheets, which of course can be shown off to the investors as profit, even though it is not anywhere near sustainable. Eventually, you run out of employees to fire. So then, what do? They go outside the U.S. to foreign countries where they can buy 3 in the Philippines or India for the price of 1 single American. The catch is, other countries have such a cultural misunderstanding that they still have to be overseen by an American to make sure that the job is done right, the message gets across, and the end results make sense to the consumer and stockholders, their customers, consumers. That then puts the company in a position for IPO, which generates even more revenue because now they have the false sense of a brand new company, even though it retains many of the problematic leadership and practices before they laid everyone off. But the public won't know that for at least a year or two. The company can set its IPO and start seeing the money come back in. This then sets them up for another cash infusion. This is where they start looking for a buyer or a corporation or equity firms that would be interested in buying the company again. By this point, anyone who has made it through the multi-year nightmare of layoffs that they're told over and over again were not going to happen is probably looking at early retirement because they may have gotten lucky this last time, but may not this next go around. And once they're done, they move on to the next, going back to my previous point that they are nothing but locusts. Layoffs are not just about bad sales or performance reviews or even market downturns. It's when the company leadership get tired of what the company has been doing for years and they want to make a change. This is typically problematic for CEOs that want to make a name for themselves. We've seen it happen with Disney when Walt Disney passed away and then Roy handed off control and then Michael Eisner ended up taking over. We've seen it happen with Pixar when they got rid of John Lasseter and Disney took over. And more currently with Harley Davidson where they decided identity politics and DEI were more important than what the company was founded on. Freedom, fun, and everything fast, and of course, what used to be made in America, which sadly they can't even boast that anymore. Layoffs may be a part of a transitional strategy, but they never say what that transition is leading to or when it will even stop. Older generations for years have had the tendency of ignoring these events by simply saying, and I've worked with many of them, that's above my pay grade. And that never really made a lot of sense to me because more and more what I saw was all of the decisions that were made that were above my pay grade always inevitably ended up becoming a problem that I had to find a solution to. So how is that really above my pay grade? Especially whenever most employees know more about their job and its demands than those deciding their fate. But sadly, this is the inevitable side effect of a soulless approach to business that employees are never involved in, but still get to suffer the consequence of when the founder is gone. Sometimes I wonder if we're actually witnessing the end of an era. Sadly, founder-led companies have slowly decreased over the last couple of decades. As you have more people, younger generations that are practically conditioned. I know that I was going to follow the path of working for an already established company and with the intent of working their way up the corporate ladder. But of course, that's dependent on a working ladder still being there, which anymore, it's not. And with the cost of many things now, even startups have a hard time making it through the first few years until they're in the black. So it doesn't even seem financially viable to even work for a startup and be able to survive as an employee. The family feeling at work that has always been promoted as one of its perks is quickly going away, and some will blame it on remote work or working from home where they don't have that face-to-face interaction and dialogue with people in person. But honestly, that mentality I kind of feel was dying long before COVID. That's just when it really had its big push and gave most people, I would say the introverts, I'm an introvert myself, what really made them the most productive. That was the solitude. But still, the ironic thing about the way companies compare themselves to family is that you can't fire or lay off family. And they do it without batting an eye, because everything in the corporate world is based in self-preservation. And that also leads to siloing, which is another term they love to use for departments or groups that are cut off from others as resources. But what management in their right mind is going to share the secret to their department's success without leveraging it for themselves? Because of this, people no longer trust management, especially younger generations. They've been burned one too many times, and that's before they've even worked 5 to 10 years. Used to, it was a goal to have one job for 30 to 40 years until you retire. Not 3 to 4 jobs in 1 year. Why be excited to work for a company that you know will eventually sell its workforce out to the highest bidder? Where's the loyalty then? As companies continue to lay off workers by the literal thousands, as we've seen in the news lately, it does beg the question if companies are essentially saying they have no plan to continue their company through human progression and promotion through the ranks anymore, but are instead opting for AI that never needs a promotion, then will this end up being a new era where a new breed of founders begins and replaces the old? It's definitely not become easier, but you'd like to think it was still possible. Those who have lived through these buyouts, these acquisitions, takeovers, those are the ones who will refuse to be burned again and would rather take their chances with a dream they can control than work for those who rather they never had a dream to begin with. Outside of, of course, increasing company profits and driving exponential growth. The big question is, will the new generation of founders learn from the vast and repeated mistakes made by the new overlords, the equity firms? Or will they continue in the patterns of the present that will no doubt lead to more management mediocrity? But I'd like to know what you think. Have you worked at a company that changed after the founder left, and what did you see those changes bring about? Was it something better or was it something worse? Do you think that there is hope for future founders to actually break this cycle? I'd love to hear any thoughts or experiences you've had and might be able to expand on this interesting recurrence in the working world. As always, if you like this content, you are more than welcome to support my rants by becoming a patron, which is only $6 a month, which, given the cost of things, is less than a coffee at Starbucks. You get unique content with an individual perspective, as opposed to endless charts, graphs, and figures. There's no doubt that the founder loss definitely marks the end of an era. But it does have a chance to redeem itself with every new business that starts up new. And in the future, it would seem like a lot of those new founders might actually be more in the direction of independent blue-collar workers. Those that actually get their hands dirty and create something tangible. Of course, that is if AI doesn't take those jobs as well. But that's a rant for another ride.